Hi, I'm the Dean of the Humanities at Hertog program. My name is Mary Elizabeth Halper, and this summer I'm going to be teaching a seminar on Aristotle's Rhetoric, the locus classicus for that particular liberal art that's part of the trivium. It's the classical place, so it's like the place that you go, and in some ways it makes sense that, you know, Aristotle, he's got stuff on everything, and he has this book on the rhetoric, and it's a good place to go to sort of understand the basic components of rhetoric as an art. You know, there's some, maybe not rivalry. Plato doesn't seem to think that rhetoric is an art. Aristotle lays out a really robust account of what rhetoric consists in and its sort of intellectual structure. So he doesn't give a lot of examples of it, although he does offer quite a lot in the course of the book, quite a lot of sort of practical advice, kind of how-tos. If you're faced with this kind of situation, this is what you might want to do. So it's a good idea to sort of supplement Aristotle's rhetoric with examples of speeches, say from Cicero or some of the people in Thucydides, examples of these really persuasive speeches by generals, by senators, by politicians. Aristotle is less interested, I think, in sort of giving you a how-to manual, although again, there is a lot of practical advice. And it seems that he's more interested in saying just what rhetoric is and what it means, what it might mean for us as human beings to engage in it. So the sort of standard definition of human beings, or the rational animal, in the Greek, in Aristotle's Greek, in fact, the word rational is Latin. So what we instead have is human beings are the animals who are capable of speech. And insofar as rhetoric deals with how speech mediates between human beings, figuring out how to use speech to indicate our desires, to indicate our plans, and then trying to get other people to see the world the way that we see it, to try to persuade them to do something. I think we get a really interesting and philosophically rich view of how rhetoric, which might just seem like a kind of knack or art, but it really does have a lot to say about the kinds of beings that we are and how we interact with one another. So the book, there's 3 books to the whole book of the Rhetoric, and in the first place, in the first book, Aristotle sort of lays out the different species of rhetoric, and so we have different kinds of rhetoric that are useful for different kinds of situations. So if you want to praise someone, you might think of something like Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides, trying to praise the dead Athenians, although he ends up praising Athens, I think, a lot more. So there's that kind of rhetoric. There's the rhetoric that you use when you're trying to get someone convicted or get someone off the hook. So maybe Socrates' apology, although that's a weird case because it's unclear exactly whose side he's on, or Cicero's. So you have a kind of speech that's used in courtrooms. And then you also have a kind of speech that's used to sort of discern what is at stake. So it's not so much trying to get someone to be convicted or to get someone to be let off the hook, or to just make everybody like someone or even hate someone. But it's called deliberative rhetoric. So it's how you go about sort of convincing people, this is what we ought to do. This is the best way forward. This is the right plan. So I think, so those are the 3 different species of rhetoric. And then he gets into the structure of what any persuasive argument will have to include. It always is going to include a speaker, it's always going to include an audience, and it's always going to have some content, some message to it, the thing that you're trying to persuade others of, if you're the speaker, the thing of which you're persuaded, if you're the audience. And he identifies these sort of key elements. The speaker is he is concerned with the ethos, the character of the speaker, and he digs into what it is that how the way that the speaker presents themselves, the background of the speaker, the way that they tackle the argument and address the audience, how that fits into this the success of the persuasion. He also considers on the audience side their pathos, that is their feeling, how they're moved. So it's the way that they are affected by the speech. And so there you get there's a really rich account of all the different kinds of emotions, the way that speech can raise them, not even just words, but the way that words are arranged, how that can bring about different kinds of feelings or emotions, and which feelings or emotions are most useful in which cases. Sometimes it's really helpful to get people really angry. Sometimes it's really helpful to get people to think of themselves as above it all, or to think of themselves as calm and deliberative, and that's a kind of path, a kind of way of being affected. The last one is the logos, that is the account itself. And I think there might be a kind of tendency to think that rhetoric is bad news, that rhetoric doesn't have, rhetoric is actually inherently a way of twisting speech. But the account that Aristotle gives, the character of the speaker, the feelings inspired in the audience, they are intimately connected with the content of the speech, with the reasoning within it, with the argument that's presented. So he doesn't think that you can take those things apart very much. So there's, you might think that like the logos part of any rhetorical speech is the argument reasonable? Does it have a good foundation in data and evidence or something like that? But for him, I think it's more what is it that this particular item of persuasion, what kind of speech does it demand? And he develops this really interesting thing called an enthymeme, where instead of giving just a solid syllogism, all men are mortals, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, instead what you do is you suppress a premise. And it leads to this really, really interesting moment where the audience supplies the suppressed premise, and they feel like they're discovering something. They feel like they're learning, and they don't just feel like they're learning, but they are in fact also learning. And I say that with some hesitation because, rhetoric can be used for ill. But the best pieces of rhetoric are where the audience is also engaging in that logos. They're not just passively receiving the account, they are engaged in it. So rhetoric has this possibility of being a moment of sort of collective, communal, deliberative reasoning together, not just the speaker, not just the audience, but together they sort of meet in the enthymeme, each having sort of a part to play. So I think that's really interesting. The last book is on style, which I think is a wonderful thing to read, especially now that writing has become, at least in part, the purview of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of arguments out there that sort of what artificial intelligence does is just sort of pretty up the style. So like you can write your paper, but when you feed it into the AI, it'll just clean it up. It'll just make the style nicer, and the ideas are still yours, right? The thinking is still yours. It's just making it sound nice. And I think Aristotle's Rhetoric makes a kind of case against that. Style, arrangement, expression, that is an essential part of the speech. It's not just window dressing. It is the act of communicating through speech. It is central to it. It is essential to it. And it's not something that is sort of just, you're able to sort of decouple from that activity. So I think, yeah, if you're interested in whether AI has a role to play in putting together speeches, Aristotle's account of style is a really interesting place to look for sort of an argument against. I think against thinking that style is just something superfluous, something that is just coincidental, I guess, to what's really happening in a piece of writing. One of the reasons that I think this text is especially well suited to high school teachers is that it is a way to be extremely thoughtful about speech. It's an opportunity to think more carefully about what's happening when you communicate with someone else. And given that the mode of interaction that teachers have with their students, and in some ways, yeah, the mode that everybody has with everybody else, but I think in particular the way that a teacher has with their students, it's in the medium of speech. You're trying to communicate, presumably. The best teachers, at least I think, are not just there to, don't think of themselves as merely shuttling information packets into the souls of their students, like into the brains of their students. I think most teachers think about, most of the best teachers think about what they do as really engaging the soul of their students, to engaging the mind of their students to take up what's being put in front of them for themselves. And there's an element of persuasion, I think, that's absolutely necessary there. If the students knew what they were supposed to learn and therefore why it's worth learning, they wouldn't need to learn it. They would already know it. So I think the teacher especially is in a kind of strange rhetorical position, because they're trying to persuade the students to do this thing that to take up this activity of inquiry, to take up this activity of learning, when the students, by the very structure of what they're engaged in, can't tell exactly where it's going to go. So the teacher has to, well, let me put it like this. I think a teacher is always already using rhetoric, thinking about rhetoric. So I think this is an opportunity to have moments of reflection on what that activity involves, because they're already doing it. So might as well be thoughtful about it as well. So I'm really hoping that part of our conversation will include examples, anecdotes, and stories from their own teaching practice, where we see maybe some of the things that Aristotle's talking about, or contrary examples to what Aristotle's talking about from their own way of their own examples of what Aristotle is talking about, or maybe contrary examples to what Aristotle is talking about, derived from their own experience in engaging with rhetoric with their students. So again, rhetoric has maybe not the best reputation. There might be some rehabilitation that's needed. Rhetoric can frequently bring up senses of just straight manipulation, where the real task has to be trying to pull one over on someone. Aristotle's account, he when he describes what rhetoric is, he says it's the art of persuasion by the best means, or with the proper means. So Aristotle, I think, is concerned a little bit about, or let me rephrase that. I think Aristotle is concerned about the ethical dimension, the moral dimension, whether this art could actually be a corruption of, our ability to speak to one another. But I think, this is a really interesting question as we read this text. Is there an argument from within rhetoric, not just from without, saying, here's how speech should be used, let's make our art of rhetoric in conformity with that, but through investigating the elements of rhetoric, what it demands to be an art, does that come with its own intrinsic boundaries, with its own intrinsic sort of prescriptions and proscriptions of how language should and should not be used? I think that's a really interesting argument to pursue. So then the sort of you shouldn't, the finger wagging, you shouldn't use speech like that, can become something, I think, richer and more compelling. Speech doesn't want to be used like that. There's something inherently wrong with, unnatural, perverted of using speech like that. So he has a kind of, his understanding of speech seems to be sort of laden with goodness already. And I think that's a really interesting question that a sort of consistent study of rhetoric could shed some light on. There's a moment in the third book, which is on style, and frequently the third book is not read. Again, there's this presumption that style is not that important. The real meat is in the theory of the rhetoric. But there's one moment in the book on style where Aristotle talks about metaphor as a linguistic device, and he says, and therefore as a rhetorical device. And he says that metaphors are really effective because everyone loves to learn. And it's just this stark claim. It echoes what he says at the beginning of the metaphysics. All human beings by nature stretch themselves out for knowledge or desire to understand. But here it is down in just one of the most basic ways that we use speech. Metaphor. We use metaphors all the time. Our language is ridden with metaphors that have been forgotten as metaphors. And he has this moment where he says, because we love to learn. That's why metaphors work. Because you're doing some sort of work. You're putting A next to B and C next to D, and you're seeing the way that A is like B and C is like D. You are supplying that for yourself and discovering the kind of richness of similarity and difference that's there, not like as a task. It happens so quickly. It's almost can go under the radar. There's a nice metaphor. It can sort of exist below the level of your notice. But when you say Achilles is a lion, you're thinking so much already without even explicitly realizing it. And I think that power of speech, knowing, this idea that I can use those rich words, you can use the metaphor. And in my own experience, I know this to be true when someone else says something that is super evocative. And there's just so much more going on than you might expect by saying, well, how do I put this? Like a simple proposition where A is B. If that's a metaphor, so much richer than sort of reducing it down to a simple identifying statement. And the idea that there's some richness happening on the side of the students that I don't have access to, but hopefully through the course of, say, conversation, it'll come out. I think that's been a huge part of that's served. That has been a recurring thought as I've taught the last several years, that there's you can't anticipate, you can't fully anticipate, because it is so rich, what your speech will invoke in the other. So that both, I think, puts kind of a responsibility on you as the speaker to try to anticipate as much as possible, but then also sort of gives you something that you didn't put there yourself. Yeah, so one of the a strange thing about a seminar on Aristotle's Rhetoric is that we will be together talking a lot about speech, but presumably not executing rhetoric, at least as it's traditionally conceived, upon each other. That is, we will try to be having a conversation. And I think, again, a really big, interesting question that arises from thinking about rhetoric, from thinking, and then in particular thinking about Aristotle's Rhetoric, is what if it's not just one person speaking at length to an audience? What if it's a back and forth? What if there's a dialectic to it? A dialogue where the speech is sort of moving between the parties. Yeah, I think that's an open question. I think it's a rich question, and it's definitely one we'll have an opportunity to pursue, because I'm going to be running the class as a conversation, with that collaborative element where we're going to read carefully. We're going to take up the questions that arise from within the text together. And again, operating on that idea that there's more going on. There's all these sort of dimensions to speech that are around just the basic content of the proposition. That those dimensions come into play in a conversation and can take it into not only surprising and rich directions, but gives it this kind of really makes the fact that we have so many people, not too many, it'd only be 15, but the fact that we have a plurality, we have a diversity of backgrounds and interests, all of that will feed into making that conversation rich and rigorous. So no one's going to be giving speeches in the class on rhetoric. We're just going to be talking about giving speeches, but I think that, my experience has been always that those conversations are exceptional when it's based on a really rich text and undertaken with a seriousness about not only understanding what the text is saying, but also understanding how what it has to say about our own being human. And again, I think with teachers, this is inevitably a live issue for them, given that they give speeches to their students. So I have every hope that the conversation is going to be rich and wonderful. As every classical teacher sort of knows, it's like tattooed on their eyes, I guess. The liberal arts consist of the trivium and the quadrivium, and the trivium is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And Aristotle's Rhetoric actually does have all of those. He has some logic in there. You're going to find something maybe a little less strict and rigorous than you would find in say, the prior analytics or on interpretation or something like that. But he has some interesting things to say about logic, and he also has some interesting things to say about grammar, especially in the third book on style, which we definitely will be reading. So Aristotle's Rhetoric is kind of it's a kind of concentrated shot of the trivium, like a 3-in-1 situation, which I think is a great way to spend just a few weeks of really sort of taking this book in. And the reason that it can be done in such a short amount of time, I think, is because we'll have a number of people working on it together who are all coming at it with their own questions and insights and background. So I think rhetoric is not only does it have a place within the tradition as an art, and then Aristotle, of course, as one of the best there is, but also it's just sort of an evergreen matter of practical and theoretical interest for educators. So I think one of the richest ideas that gets developed in Aristotle's Rhetoric, and would also be, I think, most surprising, not because it's totally novel, but surprising because it's sort of already always around and maybe you just haven't noticed it, but then once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere. It's called the enthymeme. It's a sort of a syllogism, so a line of reasoning, but it has a premise suppressed. That is to say, it's missing a premise. So it's not just an incomplete syllogism, but it's a designedly incomplete syllogism. And the idea is that it's the premise is supposed to be supplied by the person that's receiving it, maybe without explicit awareness. And this is where I think maybe some of the less than honorable versions of rhetoric might show up, because you're sort of hoping that, well, so a bad way to use rhetoric is to hope that the audience supplies a premise that's faulty without realizing it. And in some ways that's trading on what we always are doing. We're always sort of bringing in presuppositions, bringing in a sort of holistic view of how things work together, and we get an argument and sort of immediately integrate it into what we're doing. You see, find ourselves nodding along. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Not because they're laying out a solid syllogism where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premise, but when we nod and say, yeah, that's right, it's because it's fitting into what we already think and believe. And I think the enthymeme, it's just a beautiful, so insightful from Aristotle to recognize that that's what's happening. And once you see it, again, it's really hard to unsee. Which you sort of realize you got your head on, like, yeah, I think that's right. Like, it gives you a chance to say immediately, oh, what am I supplying in this argument? Does it actually work? What am I bringing to it to make this logos actually go through? And sometimes what you're bringing to it is has everything to do with the character of the speaker, how you relate to the speaker, what you already think about the speaker. So sometimes the premise that gets supplied is very much influenced by the ethos of the speaker. Sometimes it's very much influenced by your own feelings, your emotions, having to do with a certain topic. So for Aristotle, all of these things are involved, but the enthymeme is sort of where they all come together, where the ethos of the speaker, the pathos of the audience, and they come together and meet in the logos, because there's this opportunity, there's this like room for it to happen, because that premise is missing and needs to be supplied. So I like to think of the enthymeme as sort of the meeting place between the speaker and the audience. And again, I think it just happens all the time. And then once you see it, oh, there's an enthymeme, and there's another enthymeme. So I think surprising, not because it's a totally new take on what's happening, but surprising that this thing that's been around you all along, now you see it clearly. While I think there will be some sort of direct benefit to what they do in the classroom or what they do for their school, the people who take this seminar, I think the real benefit, the benefit that I'm most concerned about, is just letting these educators, these people who are serving education, having them serve their own education for a little bit. I do think that one of the things that makes the task of learning most compelling is when the person who's leading that, trying to lead students to engage in that task, has a real, genuine love for it, a passion for it, a deep respect for it. And it's tough, I think, to feel that gratitude when you're teaching all year long. And when you see, I mean, I hope for most of these people, there are wonderful moments of sincere gratitude on this part of their students, that the lights go on, you see that sparkle in their eyes. It's just one of the most thrilling things. But of course, there's also bumps in the road. There's also friction. There's also moments where certain students for sure don't want to keep doing it, and it's tough to take something that you love so dearly and see it sort of, I don't really want to do that. So I'm really hoping that one of the things that reading the Rhetoric this summer will do is to revitalize that love, that respect, that gratitude, so that when they go back into the classroom, whether or not anything that they learn from Aristotle's Rhetoric will be directly useful, at the very least, this sense of, oh yes, this is why I'm doing this, because learning is so sustaining, because it does contribute so deeply to my own flourishing. That being said, I do think that there are some really interesting direct practical possibilities or direct practical benefits that are possible from reading Aristotle's Rhetoric. I think one of the things that is useful is this. Again, I'm just going to harp on the style section, because I think it's a shame when it doesn't get read. But I think one of the things that teachers have to do, and I think it's especially looking at college students, I see a lot of college students, I read a lot of writing from college students, and being able to write well is just, it's going to become, I think it's going to become one of the most distinguishing factors of someone who's had a really good education and someone who hasn't. So I think having that attention to style, to composition, to phrasing and organization, I think that's going to be a really interesting moment for teachers that I'm hoping they'll take into their work, or staff and taking it into their work. I think also there's a way in which it's a kind of crash course in emotional intelligence, because one of the things that you have to do if you're going to be an effective rhetor is be able to read the room, be able to anticipate what kind of feelings or emotions are going to be roused, knowing what the emotional topography is before you start making your speech, so that you can figure out how to either use what's already there to your ends, or now it's sounding really manipulative, how to use what's already there to your ends, or to turn it around to a different end. So I think that's another thing that is that's a really interesting and potentially really helpful aspect of this book, is that we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about emotions, and I think in a really insightful way. So I think those at the very least are going to be super helpful. But I don't know, there might be a way in which learning how to praise something is going to be helpful if you're going to try to convince a student that this book really is super good. I mean, I know I struggle with that. I feel like if it's good, it's obviously good. I should just be able to put the good thing in front of you, and you should just be able to see its goodness and say, yes, of course, I'm 100% in. We're going to read this book super well. But that is not how it happens. And it's not because the book is not actually good. It's not because the student isn't good. It's just the basic way in which we need to learn about things. And so I think being able to figure out how to accurately, authentically represent what is truly good, being able to praise these books in a way that's effective, in a way that resonates with the people who don't yet know what's so good about them. I think that's another aspect of this class that I think could be potentially really directly beneficial. The Humanities at Hertog has traditionally offered their courses to current undergraduates, recent graduates, graduate students, and young professionals. And while I think faculty and staff at classical schools certainly fall into the category, a lot of them fall into the category of young professionals, I think given that our classes happen over the year, it's not been terribly welcoming for those people. So I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to offer to offer a taste of what we do at the Humanities at Hertog program to the people who are on the front lines, so to speak, of making sure that the humanities have a future, of making sure that reading these books, talking about them, taking seriously the responsibility that every single one of us has because we have the capacity for speech, because we have the capacity to read, to write, to speak with one another. That comes with certain obligations, and as far as I can tell, it's the people who are in these classical schools who not only have a real sense of that obligation and their corresponding duty to instill that sense in these young people, but also are the ones that are doing that work. So in some ways, it's a kind of giving back, because I've been leading seminars, I've been putting seminars together in the humanities program where we're seeing the effects, the great effects of all that good work in these young people who are so hungry to learn and have such an not only an appetite but an aptitude for that learning, for reading these books. It seems just natural that the people who instilled that in them, encouraged it, nurtured it in them, would also have a similar appetite and aptitude. So I think this class in particular, for the people who are engaging in that service year in, year out, I'm just very honored to be able to have this opportunity for them. They spend their whole year pouring themselves out into their students, pouring all of their energy, intellectual, emotional, etc., energy into these young people. And I'm hoping that this will be an opportunity to have their own intellectual and emotional energy be served by the seminar.